The most glittering event of the year, the Thanksgiving Gala inside our grand glass conservatory. Surrounded by delicate orchids and hundreds of flashing cameras, my husband David raised his father's silver wolf head cane, screaming at me to sign a false embezzlement confession. The heavy silver struck the table, threatening to shatter my life. I didn't tremble, I didn't beg. I simply, silently, swiped my finger across the master control tablet. As the giant LED screen flickered to life, our buried family truths were about to bloom into a magnificent, inescapable scandal. How did I get here? To answer that, we have to go back. For 5 years, I lived as a ghost in my own home. I am Eleanor. By profession, I am an archivist, someone who preserves history, who organizes the past so it makes sense in the present. But in my marriage, I was just a shadow. David's family owned one of the largest media empires in the city, but their true pride was their grand estate. It was a sprawling mansion designed with a strict, minimalist botanical aesthetic. Everywhere you looked, there were rare ferns, delicate creeping vines, and exotic plants housed in sleek, temperature-controlled glass rooms. It was clean, flawlessly green, and completely devoid of human warmth. I spent my days walking through those vast, quiet corridors, feeling exactly like one of Evelyn's prized potted plants. Decorative, silent. Trapped in a beautiful, expensive glass cage. The air was always perfectly filtered, yet I found it incredibly hard to breathe. Evelyn, my mother-in-law. She was the chairwoman of the family's renowned charity foundation. To the outside world, she was a modern saint in tailored designer clothes, a woman who dedicated her life to philanthropy and social grace. Behind the closed doors of our minimalist fortress, she was an absolute dictator. Her words were the only law that mattered. She never yelled. She didn't have to. Her cruelty was elegantly subtle, delivered with a soft voice and a pristine smile. I remember a family dinner just weeks before everything shattered. The long table was set with flawless white linens and a minimalist centerpiece of white orchids. Evelyn looked at the extensive archival report I'd spent weeks compiling for her charity. She didn't even open the folder. She simply pushed it aside with a manicured finger and smiled thinly at the guests. "Eleanor, dear," she had said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Your little filing hobby is so cute. Oh, it keeps you out of trouble while David does the real, important work, doesn't it?" I just lowered my head and smiled. It was a programmed response, a pathetic survival mechanism I had perfected over 5 long, suffocating years. I learned to swallow my pride, to nod, to accept her passive-aggressive insults just to keep the peace. I thought being submissive meant being a supportive wife. I thought my infinite patience would eventually earn me a place of respect at their table. I was so terribly wrong. And where was David in all of this? My husband. The charismatic media executive who smiled perfectly for the cameras and spoke of family values. Whenever his mother humiliated me, David would just look down at his plate or suddenly find his phone fascinating. In highly toxic family structures, people try to maintain a psychological state known as false peace. I didn't know the exact term back then. I just knew the heavy, sinking feeling in my chest every single night. To protect the pristine illusion of a happy, flawless family, the members will silently compromise and turn the weakest person into a scapegoat. That was me. I was the silent sacrifice on the altar of their public image. David's indifference during those 5 years, watching his wife being verbally diminished by his mother, wasn't just simple cowardice. He was actively operating as an enabler. By ignoring my pain, he was deflecting attention from his mother's deeply flawed, dictatorial nature. He would rather step on his powerless wife to keep his tiny sliver of control than face the rotting core of his own mother. Men like David always excuse their silence by claiming they just want to keep the peace. They say they hate conflict. But science and bitter experience prove otherwise. When you deliberately ignore abuse to buy your own quiet comfort, you are not a peacemaker. You are a silent accomplice. True peace can never be built on the sacrificed dignity of someone else, but I didn't realize that yet. I kept my head down, organizing their charitable records, watering their rare plants, trying my best to remain invisible. I thought if I stayed quiet enough, If I blended into the background of this minimalist house, the storm would pass over me. I deceived myself into believing this cold green mansion was a safe harbor. I thought I could survive the frost. But the absolute truth was quietly waiting for me, hidden deep inside the very documents I was hired to protect. The days leading up to the Thanksgiving Gala were always a masterclass in orchestrated perfection. Our estate transformed into a fortress of caterers, florists, and lighting technicians. Everything had to be flawless. This wasn't just a party, it was the absolute crown jewel of my mother-in-law's charitable foundation. Amidst the frantic chaos walked Julian. He was the family's financial lawyer and my sister-in-law's husband. Julian had a smile that could disarm a judge and a perfectly tailored suit for every occasion. He always knew exactly what to say to make Evelyn feel like a queen. But if you looked closely, his eyes never quite matched that charming smile. They were always calculating, always assessing the exact value of the person standing in front of him. As beside him was Chloe, my sister-in-law. Chloe was undeniably beautiful, but she possessed the fragile, nervous energy of a bird born in a gilded cage. She depended entirely on her mother's approval and Julian's smooth reassurances to simply get through the day. She lived inside a pristine bubble of luxury, completely blind to the sharp, jagged edges of the people she loved the most. And then, there was Evelyn. Evelyn was the undeniable star of this show. For weeks, I watched her stand in front of the grand mirror, rehearsing her gala speech. She spoke so passionately about compassion, about giving back to the community, about the sacred, unbreakable bonds of humanity. If you heard her, you would genuinely think she was an angel walking among us. But the real Evelyn didn't exist on a brightly lit stage. The real Evelyn lived inside her massive, climate-controlled orchid greenhouse. The greenhouse was her ultimate sanctuary. It was an architectural marvel of glass and steel, filled with the rarest, most breathtakingly expensive orchids in the world. And it was there, surrounded by delicate white petals, that her true, bitter nature fully bloomed. I remember bringing her the final guest list one afternoon. The air inside was thick, suffocatingly humid. She was carefully pruning a dying stem on a rare ghost orchid. She didn't even bother to look at me when she spoke. She just methodically snipped the leaves, her voice sharp and cold like the steel shears in her hand. She complained endlessly about Chloe's pathetic weakness. She mocked David's desperate, hollow obsession with his public image. And she tore down every single member of our family with ruthless, surgical precision. To her, we were just like the plants in her greenhouse. We only had value if we made her look good. If we failed, she would simply cut us off and throw us away. It used to confuse me so deeply. How could a woman who dedicated her entire public life to charity be so remarkably cruel to her own blood? But there is a fascinating, terrifying psychological concept called moral licensing. It explains a very dark truth about human nature. When people perform highly visible acts of goodness, like running a massive, celebrated charity, they unconsciously build up a moral bank account in their own minds. They feel they have earned so many good points in the public eye that they are somehow entitled to commit dark, unethical deeds in secret. What Evelyn truly believed, her sweeping philanthropy bought her the right to be an absolute monster behind closed doors. She was writing massive checks to save the world, while emotionally bankrupting everyone inside her own home. I watched her carefully wipe the blades of her shears with a pristine white cloth. She looked so incredibly satisfied, so utterly untouchable. She believed she was the grand architect of our reality. She thought she had completely domesticated Julian, that she effortlessly controlled David, and that I was just a quiet, harmless archivist who would never dare to look beneath the surface. But when you spend years organizing someone else's history, going through their private records and forgotten files, you eventually notice when the numbers stop making sense. And the spotless and charitable empire Evelyn was so incredibly proud of was built on a foundation of spectacular million-dollar lies. I spent most of my time in the estate's private archive room. It was a beautiful, sterile space lined with pale oak shelves and glass display cases containing Evelyn's prized pressed botanical specimens. It was meant to be a place of quiet preservation. But for me, it was just another corner to hide in. As the Thanksgiving Gala approached, my assigned task was to compile the Foundation's annual financial summaries for the press packets. I was going through the digital ledgers, quietly matching the massive donation receipts with the outgoing charitable grants. At first, it was just a tiny discrepancy. A missing invoice here, a transferred sum there. But as I dug deeper into the encrypted subfolders, the numbers began to bleed into a terrifying pattern. A $500,000 grant to a wildlife preserve that simply didn't exist, $2 million routed to a legal consultancy firm registered under a fake name, the grand celebrated foundation that Evelyn paraded in front of the world, the very reason we were hosting hundreds of billionaires tomorrow night, was a rotting, empty shell. Millions of dollars were gone. My hands began to shake over the keyboard. I stared at the glowing monitor, the bright blue light reflecting in my terrified eyes. The silence in the archive room suddenly felt incredibly loud, pressing heavily against my eardrums. There is a profound, crushing psychological weight that comes with being the sole keeper of a dangerous secret. It is a very specific type of terror. When you uncover a truth that has the power to destroy an entire empire, your first human instinct is to scream for help, to run to someone you trust. But then the cold, hard reality sets in. Who do you tell? You are completely, utterly alone. If I went to the authorities, Evelyn's army of high-priced lawyers would twist the narrative and crush me before I even reached the police station. If I told the family, they would simply close ranks and erase me. The isolation in that moment was absolute. I looked around at the dead, pressed botanical specimens trapped under the glass, realizing that my own life was about to be just as fragile. I couldn't afford to act on raw emotion. I had to be cold. I had to be absolutely sure of the data. I needed external, undeniable proof. So, I picked up my phone. My fingers were trembling as I typed out a discreet message to an independent auditor I trusted from my college days, a man named Thomas. I didn't give him the whole story. I simply asked him to quietly verify 3 specific corporate routing numbers, just to see if they were legally registered entities. It was a calculated, rational move, a desperate attempt to arm myself with facts before the inevitable storm hit. I set my phone face down on the sleek, white marble island in the kitchen and walked into the adjoining bathroom to splash freezing water on my burning face. It was the biggest mistake I could have made. When I walked back into the kitchen, the heavy silence of the house had shifted. David was standing by the marble island. My phone was in his hand, the screen glowing brightly against the dim, minimalist lighting. The charming media-trained smile he wore every single day was completely gone. In its place was a cold, twisted expression that made the blood freeze in my veins. I stepped forward, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I thought he had read the routing numbers. I thought he realized I knew about the missing millions. But what came out of his mouth was something far more insidious. He slammed the phone onto the marble counter with a sharp, violent crack. "Who is Thomas?" he screamed, his voice shattering the quiet elegance of the room. "You are sneaking around, texting another man behind my back the night before our biggest gala." I froze. I was entirely speechless. He wasn't asking about the money or the audit. He had seen a male name on a notification, and in a fraction of a second, he weaponized it. He was using the mere existence of a harmless message to instantly construct a false, filthy narrative of an affair. It was a calculated, terrifying pivot. He didn't want the truth. He wanted to establish dominance. He wanted a weapon to gaslight me, to put me on the defensive, to completely break my spirit before I could even process the financial crimes I had just witnessed. In his eyes, I saw no love, no trust. I only saw a predator who had just found the perfect excuse to tear his prey apart. Before I could even process the insane accusation about Thomas, David's grip tightened around my arm. He didn't let me speak. He just dragged me down the long, silent hallway, past the glass walls of the indoor garden, and pushed me through the heavy oak doors of his father's old study. The air in the room was thick. Smelling of old leather and expensive scotch, sitting behind the massive mahogany desk was Evelyn. She looked entirely too calm. She was wearing her pristine white gala dress, sipping tea as if she were waiting for a casual afternoon meeting. There was a single, crisp piece of paper resting on the polished wood in front of her, and a heavy silver pen. I stood there, struggling to breathe, my arm throbbing where David had grabbed me. I looked at David, then at Evelyn. I thought, in my naive, desperate mind, that this was about the missing millions. I thought they had discovered the financial black hole too, and were panicking. But Evelyn just smiled that same, terrifying, artificial smile. She tapped the silver pen against the desk. "Sit down, Eleanor," she said, her voice completely flat. "We have a tiny administrative issue to clear up before the guests arrive tomorrow." I stepped forward, my eyes dropping to the paper on the desk. It wasn't an audit report, it was a confession. A legally binding, fully drafted admission of guilt. It detailed how I, Eleanor, the trusted family archivist, had systematically embezzled millions of dollars from the foundation over the past 3 years. My name was printed at the bottom, waiting for a signature. There is a very specific, paralyzing terror that hits you when you realize you are the target of organized systemic gaslighting. Psychologists call it mobbing. It is the feeling of your entire reality collapsing all at once. Because the people who are supposed to be your closest family have secretly united to destroy you, they weren't just lying to me. They were rewriting my entire existence to use me as a human shield. They had the wealth, the media connections, and the power to make any lie become the absolute truth in the eyes of the public. I looked at the two of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, and I realized they had planned this from the very beginning. I was never a daughter-in-law to them. I was just a convenient scapegoat waiting to be slaughtered when the foundation's accounts finally ran dry. I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. "I won't sign this. I didn't take a single dime. You know I didn't do this." David stepped closer, his tall frame blocking the only exit. He held up my phone, the screen still showing the innocent text to the auditor. "You didn't just steal, Eleanor," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You stole millions to fund a secret. A filthy affair with another man. We have the texts. We have the proof of your infidelity." Evelyn took a slow sip of her tea. "If you sign the paper right now, Eleanor, we will be merciful," she said smoothly. "We will handle the missing funds internally. We will announce a quiet, private divorce, and you will walk away with nothing, but you will walk away free. But if you refuse to sign, David will hand your phone to our legal team. We will expose you to the press tomorrow morning as a thief and a cheating wife. With our lawyers, you won't just lose your reputation. You will spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal prison cell, or a quiet, completely ruined life." They were forcing me to choose between a cage of steel and a cage of lies. The sheer audacity of their cruelty made the room spin. They had drained the charity themselves, filling their own pockets. And now they were going to feed me to the wolves to keep their pristine white gala shining. They stared at me, waiting for me to break. Waiting for the quiet, submissive archivist to finally collapse and do what she was told. For 5 years, I had bowed my head. I had accepted every insult, every slight to keep their false peace. I looked at the silver pen, then at the man I had promised to love for the rest of my life. He wasn't my husband. He was my warden. I looked at the heavy silver pen resting on the confession. I looked at Evelyn, sipping her tea with that terrifying calmness, and then at David, waiting for me to completely break. Slowly, I pushed the paper away. "I won't sign a lie," I whispered. Julian let out a slow, patronizing sigh. Chloe refused to make eye contact, staring intensely at the floorboards. But Evelyn? She simply placed her teacup perfectly on its saucer, giving David a sharp, expectant look, a cold look that clearly said, "Control your wife." That single glance from his mother completely unraveled. David, his perfectly curated, media-trained smile, vanished. The handsome mask cracked, revealing something incredibly ugly, desperate, and raw beneath it. He realized his intimidation wasn't working. I wasn't sobbing, I wasn't dropping to my knees and begging for mercy as they had all anticipated. He turned abruptly, marching to the dark oak display case in the corner of the study. Resting, there was his late father's cane. A thick, polished piece of black walnut, topped with a heavy, solid silver wolf's head. He grabbed it. The silver gleamed coldly under the warm reading lamps. Before I could even brace myself, he swung the heavy cane downward with terrifying force. the silver wolf crashed into the glass coffee table between us. The thick glass shattered into 1,000 jagged shards, exploding like ice across the antique Persian rug. I flinched, shielding my face as the sharp pieces scattered across my shoes. "Sign the damn paper!" David roared, his voice cracking with a manic edge. He stepped right through the broken glass, the shards crunching violently beneath his expensive leather shoes. He advanced on me until my back hit the cold, wood-paneled wall of the study. "Sign it right now, or I swear to God you will regret it." Many people might ask, why would a polished, highly educated media executive suddenly resort to such brutal, primal violence over a simple refusal? It seems so extreme, so entirely out of character for the charming man the public adored. But looking back at my 5 years trapped inside that botanical fortress, I realized the red flags had always been there, carefully camouflaged under the guise of traditional values and protection. David never truly saw me as an equal partner. To him, I was a possession. A fragile, naive child that needed to be constantly managed, corrected, and disciplined. Living his entire life under the crushing, dictatorial shadow of Evelyn, and constantly compared to the smooth-talking, fiercely ambitious Julian. David's own ego was incredibly fragile. His self-esteem was paper-thin. I was the absolute only thing in that sprawling estate that he had total, unquestioned control over. Whenever I showed a spark of independence, whenever I relied on my own intellect, like reaching out to a professional auditor to verify numbers, that deep-seated inferiority complex inside David was violently triggered. Pulling his father's silver cane wasn't just a sudden burst of blind rage. It was the ultimate act of degradation. It was a psychological tactic of infantilization. He wanted to use physical intimidation, the exact kind of primitive punishment you would use on a disobedient child to completely break my independent will. That cane was his tool to force me to my knees, to strip away my dignity as an adult woman, and mold me back into the silent, submissive sheep he could comfortably hold in the palm of his hand. He raised the heavy silver cane again, leveling the wolf's head right at my face. His hand was actually shaking. The air whistled around the metal as he adjusted his grip. A terrifying, high-pitched sound that cut through the silence of the study like a blade. But strangely, in that exact fraction of a second, my heart stopped racing. The paralyzing fear simply evaporated as I stared at the man I'd given my youth to. The man who was now threatening me with a silver weapon while his family watched with cold, soulless eyes. Every last illusion I had about our marriage shattered, just like the glass covering the floor. My heart didn't hurt anymore. It turned to solid ice. I realized I was never loved. I was only ever owned. I was no longer the sacrificial lamb waiting for the slaughter. No. Tonight, amidst the glittering lights of the Thanksgiving Gala waiting just outside those doors, I was going to show them that when you corner a quiet archivist, she doesn't just surrender, she rewrites your entire history. The heavy oak doors of the study swung open, and the muffled sound of classical strings instantly turned into a deafening roar of applause. We walked out into the grand hall. It was transformed into a breathtaking botanical paradise. Cascading vines of white wisteria hung from the glass ceilings, and hundreds of crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the city's most elite billionaires, politicians, and socialites. Waiters floated through the crowd with trays of expensive champagne. Everything was picture perfect. Everything was a beautifully orchestrated lie. David kept his hand tightly gripped around my lower back. To the cameras flashing around us, it looked like the supportive touch of a loving husband. But his fingers were digging so deeply into my spine it felt like a threat. "Smile, Eleanor," he whispered through his teeth, his charming, media-ready face beaming at a passing senator. "Just walk to the side of the stage. When my mother calls your name, you step up to the microphone. You tell them the pressure of the archives became too much. You tell them you made a terrible mistake, and you apologize to the foundation. If you cry, it will look better." I didn't say a word. I just kept walking, my footsteps completely silent on the marble floor. Up on the main stage, Evelyn was standing behind a clear acrylic podium, looking like a flawless, benevolent queen in her white gown. Behind her was a massive floor-to-ceiling LED screen displaying the foundation's glowing golden logo. She was speaking into the microphone. her voice echoing through the grand hall with that sickening, artificial warmth. "We are gathered here tonight, not just to celebrate wealth, but to celebrate family," Evelyn proclaimed, placing a delicate hand over her heart. "To protect the vulnerable, to shine a light in the dark, and to hold each other accountable to the highest moral standards." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Julian was standing in the front row, clapping enthusiastically, his arm wrapped around a pale, nervous Chloe. David leaned down to my ear. The grip on my spine tightened until I could barely breathe. "Get ready," he hissed. "This is your moment, Eleanor. Take the fall, or I will destroy you." I looked at the crowd, hundreds of pairs of eyes, ready to consume a perfectly packaged scandal, ready to pity the grand, uncharitable family that had been betrayed by a greedy, low-class daughter-in-law. Society has a very specific script for a cornered woman. When we are unjustly accused, when we are pushed to the absolute edge of our sanity, everyone expects a predictable show. They expect tears. They expect us to scream, to fall to our knees, to become hysterical. They want the loud, messy breakdown because a hysterical woman is easy to dismiss. A crying woman is weak, and weakness is something people like David and Evelyn know exactly how to crush. But there is a terrifying, undeniable power in the calm before the storm. When a woman realizes she has absolutely nothing left to lose, the panic simply evaporates. The tears dry up. You don't need to raise your voice when you hold the absolute truth in your hands. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I reached into the hidden pocket of my evening gown and pulled out my small black tablet. David glanced down, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" "Put that away," he commanded in a harsh whisper, reaching out to grab my wrist. But he was too late. I didn't need a heavy silver cane to make an impact. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I simply tapped the master override sequence I'd coded into the Foundation's audio-visual network earlier that afternoon. I looked David dead in the eyes, my face completely, chillingly calm. "No, David," I whispered. "This is your moment." My finger pressed the final button. A harsh, electronic screech tore through the grand hall, instantly drowning out Evelyn's speech. The elegant classical music abruptly cut off. The massive LED screen behind the podium flickered violently. The glowing golden logo of the charity shattered into static. The crowd gasped. The applause died instantly, replaced by a confused, restless murmur. Evelyn tapped her microphone, her perfect smile faltering for the very first time. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be having a slight technical—" She didn't get to finish her sentence. The static on the 50-foot screen cleared, replaced by crisp, high-definition security footage. It wasn't the pre-approved montage of smiling orphans and charity galas. It was the dimly lit, humid interior of Evelyn's private restricted orchid greenhouse. The date and timestamp in the corner proved it was recorded just 2 nights ago. David's hand dropped from my waist as if he had been burned. He stared at the giant screen, the color completely draining from his handsome face. The role of the sacrificial lamb and the executioner had just been instantly, permanently reversed. I stood tall in the shadows of the stage, watching the fake, glittering empire they had built begin to burn to the ground. The silence in the grand hall was so absolute, you could hear the crystal champagne flutes trembling in the hands of the guests. Every single eye in that room was glued to the massive LED screen. The elegant classical strings had been replaced by the heavy, echoing sound of ragged breathing and skin against skin, recorded in crisp, high-definition color. When that vile video played, I imagined every single person frozen in that ballroom had 2 massive questions echoing in their minds. Why the mother-in-law when Julian had a beautiful, young wife like Chloe? And why on earth would they do it right there? I'm in the glass greenhouse where anyone could have walked in. It took me nights of staring at those hidden recordings to finally understand the terrifying truth. With a narcissist like Julian, sleeping with Evelyn had absolutely nothing to do with physical attraction. It was the ultimate, intoxicating rush of conquering power. Evelyn was the untouchable queen of the estate, the one who controlled the family vault and the philanthropic empire. By manipulating and claiming her in the dark, Julian was secretly establishing his absolute dominance over the entire bloodline. And for Evelyn, a dictatorial widow, Seducing her young, successful son-in-law was a toxic poison that fed her boundless vanity. And the greenhouse. That wasn't a careless mistake. That was the absolute peak of their arrogance, inside their castle of lies. They saw themselves as gods who could not be touched. The thrill of sneaking around in her sacred, pristine sanctuary, right under the noses of the children they thought were too stupid to notice, gave them a sick, twisted high. They weren't afraid of getting caught because they believed no one was smart enough or brave enough to ever expose them. But the visual of their betrayal wasn't even the final nail in the coffin. It was the audio that followed. The hidden microphone was incredibly clear. Cutting through the horrified silence of the VIP crowd, Julian's voice echoed through the speakers, smooth and entirely lethal. "You need to authorize the next $2 million transfer by Friday, Evelyn, or the federal auditors will suddenly receive an anonymous tip about those phantom wildlife preserves. You wouldn't want your beautiful charity to burn, would you?" A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. The flashing cameras went absolutely wild, blinding the stage with rapid bursts of white light. There was no forbidden love in that greenhouse. It was pure, predatory extortion. The charming, loyal son-in-law was actively blackmailing the untouchable matriarch while he held her in his arms. He had found the financial rot she created, and he was using his body and his leverage to bleed her empire dry. The reaction on the stage was instantaneous and catastrophic. The illusion of the flawless moral family shattered into a million unfixable pieces right in front of the city's most powerful people. Evelyn staggered backward, her face completely drained of blood, looking as white and frail as the dying orchids on the screen. Her perfectly crafted mask of philanthropy melted away, leaving only raw, naked panic and ultimate humiliation. She lunged at the clear acrylic podium, frantically slamming her hands against buttons that didn't work, screaming at the technicians to cut the power. Julian's charming smile was dead. He looked around like a cornered rat, the sheer panic vibrating through his tailored suit. He stepped away from Evelyn and instinctively tried to reach out to Chloe. But Chloe. Poor, fragile Chloe. She didn't scream. She didn't rage. She just slowly crumpled to the floor, her beautiful gala dress pooling around her like a broken parachute. She stared blankly at the 50-foot screen, watching the two people she trusted most in the entire world betray her in the most degrading, humiliating way possible. The mother she worshipped and the husband she adored were nothing but parasites feeding off her blind trust. And David? The man who just 10 minutes ago was threatening to send me to federal prison, he stood completely paralyzed. The heavy silver wolf head cane slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the wooden stage with a dull, pathetic thud. He looked at his mother, the woman he had feared and protected his entire life, and he finally saw her for what she truly was. A corrupt, pathetic hypocrite being used by her own son-in-law. His mind couldn't process it. The pristine media empire he was so desperate to protect was bleeding out for the entire world to witness. The hypocrites immediately began tearing each other apart right there on the illuminated stage, Julian shouting defensive lies, Evelyn screaming insults at him, their voices clashing over the horrific audio still playing from the speakers. I stood in the shadows for just a moment longer, watching the flames of truth consume their glass castle. I didn't need to say a single word. I simply turned around, letting the heavy oak doors of the grand hall close behind me, leaving them trapped in the spectacular inferno of their own making. I didn't run. I simply walked down the long carpeted corridor, my footsteps steady and calm. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall closed behind me, instantly cutting off the screams, the shattering glass, and the frantic flashing of cameras. The cool, crisp night air hit my face as I stepped out of that sprawling botanical fortress for the very last time. I didn't look back at the glass greenhouse. I didn't mourn the life I was leaving behind. For the first time in 5 years, I could finally breathe. I didn't take a single piece of their designer clothing, nor the expensive jewelry Evelyn had gifted me to parade me around like a show pony. I left with a single suitcase. The very next morning, I walked into a top-tier law firm. I filed for divorce. My attorney moved swiftly and ruthlessly, securing the assets I had legally brought into the marriage and demanding a fair settlement before David could even process the destruction of his public empire. We froze the joint accounts. We blocked his calls. It was clean, it was efficient, and it was entirely unapologetic. Our marriage ended exactly as it should have. Abruptly and coldly. But the public humiliation at the gala wasn't the end of it. A social scandal is just gossip, and gossip eventually fades. I knew exactly how people like Evelyn and Julian operated. They would hire expensive crisis management teams. They would spin the narrative. They would paint themselves as tragic victims of a malicious, fabricated deep fake. And eventually, they would crawl right back into their positions of untouchable power. They would never truly face the consequences of their actions unless I burned the roots entirely. So, sitting in the quiet safety of my new apartment, I pulled out a small, elegant cedar wood box. The smell of the wood was sharp and clean. Inside that box, I placed the original, unedited USB drive from the greenhouse, and beneath it, I stacked hundreds of carefully printed pages. Every single encrypted ledger, every fake invoice, every phantom wire transfer I had uncovered in the Foundation's archives. I organized their financial crimes with the exact same meticulous care I had used to organize their history. I sealed the cedar box, and I mailed it directly to the office of the federal prosecutor. There will be people who hear this story and say that my final act was too ruthless. They will say that completely destroying their lives, sending my own family to federal prison, crosses the line into pure malice. After all, I had already won. I had my freedom. I had my money. I had exposed their filthy lies to the city's absolute elite. Why not just walk away and let it go? Was it really necessary to deliver such a devastating, fatal blow? There were nights I sat in the dark, torturing myself with those exact questions. But then I realized something crucial. If I simply walked away, the true karma would never actually touch their souls. David would just hide behind a team of expensive lawyers, playing the tragic victim of a broken marriage. He would continue to lie to his own conscience. His deep cowardice and his silent complicity over those 5 years was the toxic, fertile soil that allowed all that evil to grow in the first place. That silence, that desperate need to protect his own image at the cost of my sanity, was far more terrifying than Evelyn's cruelty or Julian's betrayal. Mailing that cedar box to the federal authorities wasn't petty revenge. It was a psychological and legal exorcism. I needed the absolute, unforgiving power of the law to shatter their delusion of invincibility. They didn't respect morality. They didn't respect family. They only respected power. And I was handing them over to a power they could not manipulate or buy. Sometimes the line between justice and cruelty is incredibly thin. But to wake up people who have slept their entire lives wrapped in cowardice and arrogance, you cannot use gentle advice. You cannot just hope they learn their lesson. You have to push them into the absolute depths of consequence. You have to shine the blinding, inescapable light of the law onto their hypocrisy so they can never, ever lie to themselves again. The cedar box wasn't just a collection of evidence. It was their final judgment. The fallout from the Thanksgiving Gala wasn't just a scandal. It was a complete, structural annihilation. When a foundation is built entirely on a carefully curated illusion, there is a fascinating phenomenon called the domino effect of reputation. A single, undeniable crack doesn't just damage the surface. It compromises the entire architecture. Within 48 hours, the federal investigators had raided the estate. The media empire David had sacrificed my sanity to protect instantly turned against him, running front-page exposés on his family's corruption to save their own networks. Julian was the first to fall. The charming, silver-tongued lawyer who thought he could outsmart everyone was arrested trying to board a private flight to the Cayman Islands. He is currently facing a mountain of federal charges: extortion, wire fraud, and embezzlement. The man who used his body and his intellect to manipulate his way to the top of the food chain is now looking at a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal prison. His tailored suits have been replaced by a jumpsuit, and that calculated smile of his is permanently gone. Evelyn, the untouchable queen of the greenhouse, she didn't even make it to her arraignment. The sheer, overwhelming humiliation of having her most depraved, pathetic moments broadcasted to the city's elite triggered a massive stroke. She survived. But she was stripped of her chairmanship by the foundation's board before she even woke up in the hospital. The woman who used to control every breath we took is now confined to a sterile rehabilitation center. Her speech is slurred, her movement is restricted, and she spends her days entirely alone because none of her high society friends will ever associate with a publicly disgraced criminal. The absolute power she craved ultimately became the exact thing that destroyed her mind and body. And Chloe? I honestly felt a sharp pang of sympathy for her. She was completely blindsided, realizing that her entire life was a carefully constructed lie orchestrated by her mother and her husband. But the trauma actually forced her to wake up. She filed for a brutal, very public divorce from Julian, took full custody of their young son, and moved across the country. She cut all ties with the family name. She is no longer the fragile heiress living in a glass cage. She is a single mother, learning how to survive in the real world without the toxic safety net she used to rely on. But the person who suffered the most profound collapse was David. He wasn't the mastermind of the embezzlement, nor the orchestrator of the extortion. But his pathetic cowardice and his desperate need to protect his image made him entirely complicit. When the federal investigations concluded, the board of directors forced him to resign in disgrace. He lost his position as CEO, he lost his massive inheritance to the federal restitution fines, and he lost the one person in the world he actually had complete control over: me. I heard through mutual acquaintances that David had to sell the botanical estate just to cover his legal fees. The grand mansion with the beautiful glass greenhouse was liquidated. He now lives in a cramped, incredibly basic apartment on the outskirts of the city. He works a mid-level consulting job under an assumed name, trying desperately to avoid the absolute disgust of his former colleagues. But the worst punishment isn't the loss of his wealth or his status. It is the unavoidable mirror he has to look into every single morning. He knows, and deep in his hollow core, that he threw his own wife to the wolves just to protect a mother who was actively destroying their family. He has to live with the sickening realization that he is exactly what I called him that night: a coward. It has been over a year since that Thanksgiving gala, and my life looks completely different now. I didn't just walk away from a toxic marriage. I stepped out of a cold glass cage and finally learned how to breathe the real air. I used the settlement money to start my own private archiving firm. I no longer organize the fake, curated histories of billionaires. Instead, I help ordinary people preserve their actual, messy, beautiful family histories. Letters, old photographs, the real things that actually matter. I have my own apartment now. It's filled with sunlight and warmth. The balcony is crowded with small, resilient plants that I grew from seeds myself. I don't cultivate expensive, demanding orchids. I grow things that are strong, things that survive and thrive. And I am no longer walking this path alone. I met someone, a historian who doesn't just listen to me, but actually hears me. He never asked me to shrink myself or hide in the shadows. With him, there is no false peace. There is just peace. Looking back at the sheer devastation of that night, there is a fascinating, undeniable psychological truth about what happens to people after a massive trauma. It highlights the difference between borrowed power and inner strength. Narcissists like Evelyn and Julian built their entire identities by stepping on others. Their power was just an illusion, a balloon inflated entirely by lies. And the moment the needle of truth pierced that balloon, they completely collapsed because there was absolutely nothing solid inside them. But my journey was different. What happened to me is a clear example of post-traumatic growth. The ultimate betrayal on that Thanksgiving night didn't destroy me. It shattered my limits. It forced my brain to build a brand new defense system, and that system was my own self-worth. When you hit the absolute rock bottom of humiliation, and you find the strength to pull yourself out, you realize a profound truth. Money, reputation, and the flawless illusion of a perfect marriage can all burn to the ground in a single night. But the dignity you reclaim with your own two hands, the self-respect you forge through courage and intellect, that becomes an unbreakable shield. No one can ever take that away from you again. If you are listening to this, and you feel trapped in the shadows of someone else's ego, if you are sacrificing your own dignity just to keep a false peace, I want you to know that you are not invisible, you are not powerless, your truth matters, and your life is worth fighting for. If my story resonated with you, if it gave you even a tiny spark of courage, please share it. Leave a comment below. Let's build a community where no one has to suffer in silence. Stand up, protect your peace, and never ever let anyone turn you into a ghost in your own life.